humility, or it's
There's
less.
not enough.
There's less likely to be, or rather, science can err in taking a trajectory away from humility
Well,
without something much more powerful than an individual human.
yeah, well then, and we know, the Frankenstein story comes out of that instantly. And that's a good story for the current times. It's like you're playing around with making new life. You bloody well better make sure you have your arrows pointed up.
And it's interesting because you said science has an ethic to it. I think
It's embedded in an ethic.
Well, there's science is a big word.
Yeah.
And it includes a lot of disciplines that have different traditions. So biology, chemistry, genetics, physics, those are very different communities. And I think biology, especially when you get closer and closer to medicine and to the human body, does have a very serious, first of all, it has a history with Nazi Germany of being abused and all those kinds of things, but it has a history of taking this stuff seriously. What doesn't have a history of taking this stuff seriously is robotics and artificial intelligence, which is really interesting because you don't, you called me a scientist, but, and I would like to wear that label proudly, but often people don't think of computer science as a science, but nevertheless, it will be, I think, the science of one of the major scientific fields of the 21st century. And you should take that very seriously. Oftentimes when people build robots or AI systems, they think of them as toys to tinker with. Oh, isn't this cool?
Well,
and I feel this too. Isn't this cool?
It is cool.
But, at a certain moment, isn't this nuclear explosion cool?
Yeah,
because it is.
Or birth control pill cool. It's like, or transistor cool. Yeah. Well, the other thing too, and this is a weird problem in some sense, the robotics engineer types, they're thing people, right? I mean, the big classes of interest are interest in things versus interest in people.
Some of my best friends are thing people.
Yeah, right. And thing people are very, very clear, logical thinkers, and they're very outcome oriented and practical. Now, and that's all good. That makes the machinery and keeps it functioning. But there's a human side of the equation. And you get the extreme thing people, and you think, yeah, well, what about the human here? And when we've been talking about the necessity of having a technological enterprise embedded in an ethic, and you can ignore that, like most of the time, right? You can ignore the overall ethic in some sense when you're toying around with your toys. But when you're building an artificial intelligence, it's like, well, that's not a toy. That might be...
A toy becomes the monster very quickly.
Yes. And this is a whole new kind of monster. And maybe it's already here. Yes, and you notice how many of those things you can no longer turn off. And what is it with you engineers and your inability to put off switches on things now? It's like, I have to hold this for 5 seconds for it to shut off. Or I can't figure it. I just want to shut it off. Click off.
Well, what is it with you humans that don't put off switches on other humans? Because there's a magic to the thing that you notice, and it hurts for both you and perhaps one day the thing itself to turn it off. And so you have to be very careful as an engineer adding off switches to things. I think it's a feature, not a bug, the off switch. The off switch gives a deadline to us humans, to systems of existence. It makes you, death is the thing that really brings clarity to life. And I do think...
Yes, hence the flaming swords.
The flaming sword. I do like your view of the flame with the bush and perhaps the sword as a thing of transformation. It's also it's a transformation that kind of consumes the thing in the process.
Well, it depends on how much of the thing is chaff. This is why you can't touch the Ark of the Covenant, for example. And this is why people can have very bad psychedelic trips. It's like if you're 95% dead wood and you get too close to the flame, the 5% that's left might not be able to make it.
So you think it's all chat, but I think there is some aspect of destruction that That's, the old Bukowski line of
Mhm.
do what you love and let it kill you.
Right.
Don't you think that destruction is part of
That's humility.
that's humility? That's
You bet. You bet. You bet. It's like invite in the judgment. Invite in the judgment because maybe you can die a little bit instead of dying completely.
yeah.
And I think it's Alfred North Whitehead. We can let our ideas die instead of us, right? We can have these partial personalities that we can burn off and we can let them go before they become tyrannical pharaohs and we lose everything. And so, yeah, there's this optimal bite of death. And who knows what it would mean to optimize that? Like, what if it was possible that if you died enough all the time, that you could continue to live? And the thing is, we already know that biologically, because if you don't die properly all the time, well, it's cancerous outgrowths and like it's a very fine balance between productivity on the biological front and the culling of that, right? Life is a real balance between growth and death. And so what would happen if you got that balance right? Well, we kind of know, right? Because if you live your life properly, so to speak, and you're humble enough to let your stupidity die before it takes you out, you will live longer. That's just a fact. Well, but then what's the ultimate extension of that? And the answer is we don't know. We have no idea.
Well, let me ask you a difficult question because,
As opposed to the easy ones that you've been asking so far.
well, Dostoevsky is always just a warm up. So if death, if death every single day is the way to progress through life, you have become quite famous.
Death and hell.
Death and hell.
Yeah, because you don't want to forget the hell part.
Do you worry that your fame traps you into the person that you were before?
Yeah, well,
That
even Elvis
makes-
became an Elvis impersonator by the time he died.
Yeah. Do you fear that you have become a Jordan Peterson impersonator? Do you fear of, in some part, becoming the famous suit-wearing, brilliant Jordan Peterson? The certainty in the pursuit of truth, always right.
I think I worry about it more than anything else. I hope I do. I better.
Has fame to some degree, when you look at yourself in the mirror, in the quiet of your mind, has it corrupted you?
No doubt, in some regard. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to avoid, because things change around you. People are much more likely to do what you ask, for example, right? And so that's a danger, because one of the things that keeps you dying properly is that people push back against you optimally. This is why so many celebrities spiral out of control, especially the tyrannical types that, say, run countries. Everyone around them stops saying, yeah, you're deviating a little bit there. They laugh at all their jokes. They open all their doors. They always want something from them. The red carpet's always rolled out. It's like, well, you think, wouldn't that be lovely? It's, well, not if the red carpet is rolled out to you while you're on your way to perdition. That's not a good deal. You just get there more efficiently. And so one of the things that I've tried to learn to manage is to have people around me all the time who are critics and who are saying, yeah, I could have done that better, and you're a little too harsh there, and you're alienating people unnecessarily there, and you should have done some more background work there. And I think the responsibility attendant upon that increases as your influence increases. And as your influence increases, then that becomes a lot of responsibility. So, and then maybe have an off day. And here's an example. I've been writing some columns lately about things that perturb me, like the forthcoming famine, for example. And it's hard to take those problems on. It's difficult to take those problems on in a serious manner, and it's frightening. And it would be easier just to go up to the cottage with my wife and go out on the lake and watch the sunset. And so I'm tempted to draw on anger as a motivating energy to help me overcome the resistance to doing this. But then that makes me more harsh and judgmental in my tone when I'm reading such things, for example, on YouTube, than might be optimal. Now, I've had debates with people about that, because I have friends who say, no, if you're calling out the environmental environmentalist globalists who are harassing the Dutch farmers, then a little anger is just the ticket. But then others say, well, you don't want to be too harsh because you alienate people who would otherwise listen to you. It's like, that's a hard balance to get right.
But also maybe anger hardens your mind to where you don't notice the subtle, quiet beauty of the world. The quiet love that's always there, that permeates everything. Sometimes you can become deeply cynical about the world if it's the Nietzsche thing.
Yeah.
Battle not with monsters, lest ye become a monster.
Yeah.
And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you.
Right. But I would say, bring it on. Right? Because that's why I also say, knowing that he's absolutely right, but if you gaze into the abyss long enough, you see the light, not the darkness.
Are you sure about that?
I'm betting my life on it.
Yeah, that's a heck of a bet.
Well, that's
because it might distort your mind to where all you see
is abyss.
Is abyss.
Yeah.
Is the evil in this world.
Well, then I would say you haven't looked long enough. That's back to
you're just a limited
the swords, the flaming swords. It's like, so I said the whole story of Christ was prefigured in that image. It's like the story of Christ psychologically is radical acceptance of the worst possible tragedy. That's what it means. That's what the crucifix means. Psychologically, it's like gaze upon that which you are most afraid of. But that story doesn't end there, because in the story, Christ goes through death into hell. So death isn't enough. The abyss of innocent death is not sufficient to produce redemption. It has to be a voluntary journey to hell. And maybe that's true for everyone. And that's like, there is no more terrifying idea than that, by definition. And so then, well, do you gaze upon that? Well, who knows? Who knows?
How often do you gaze upon death, your own? How often do you remind yourself that this ride ends?
Personally?
Personally.
All the time.
Because you, as a deep thinker and philosopher, it's easy to start philosophizing and forgetting that you might die today.
The angel of death sits on every word. How's that?
How often do you actually consciously
all the time
notice the angel?
All the time. I think it's one of the things that made me peculiar. When I was in graduate school, I thought about, I had the thought of death in my mind all the time. And I noticed that many of the people that I was with, these were people I admired fine. That wasn't part of their character, but it was definitely part of mine. I'd wake up every morning. This happened for years. Think, time's short, get at it. Time's short, get at it. There's things to do. And so that was always, it's still there. And it's still there with, I would say, and it's unbearable in some sense.
Are you afraid of it? Like what's
afraid
your
of
relationship?
Death?
Yeah.
I was ready to die a year ago. And not casually. I had people I loved, So no, I'm not very worried about me, but I am very worried about making a mistake.
Yeah.
I heard Elon Musk talk about that a couple of months ago. It was really a striking moment. Someone asked him about death, and he said, just offhand, and then went on with the conversation. He said, that'd be a relief. And then he went on with the conversation. And I thought, well, he's got a lot of weight on his shoulders. I'm sure that part of him thinks, I'd be easier just if this wasn't here at all. Now, he said it offhand, but it was a telling moment in my estimation.
So for him, that's a why live question.
Mm-hmm.
The exhaustion of life. If you call it life is suffering, but the hardship.
I'm more afraid of hell than death.
You're afraid of the thing that follows.
I don't know if it follows or if it's always here. And I think we're going to find out.
What's the connection between death and hell?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know.
Is there something that needs to be done before you arrive?
You're more likely to die terribly if you live in a manner that brings you to hell. That's one connection.
And terribly is a very deep kind of concept. Okay.
Yeah. And that's a definition, by the way.
What do you make of Elon Musk? You've spoken about him a bit. You met
I'm
him.
struck with admiration. That's what I make of him.
We'll
And
go
I always
back to
think,
this idea
I always
of
think of
admiration.
that as a primary. Well, it's like, do you find this comedian funny? It's like, well, I laugh at him. You know what I mean? It's not propositional again. And so there are things I would like to ask Mr. Musk about. The Mars venture, I don't know what he's up to there. It strikes me as absurd in the most fundamental sense, because I think, well, it'd be easier just to build an outpost in the Antarctica or in the desert.
Well, how much of the human endeavor is absurd?
Well, that's what did Nietzsche say? Great men are seldom credited with their stupidity. Who the hell knows what Musk is up to? I mean, obviously he's building rockets. Now he's motivated because he wants to build a platform for life on Mars. Is that a good idea? Who am I to say? He's building the rockets, man. But I'd like to ask him about it.
I would like to see that conversation. I do think that, having talked to him quite a bit offline, I think several of his ideas, like Mars, like humans becoming a multiplanetary species, could be one of the things that human civilization looks back at as, duh, I can't believe he's one of the few people that was really pushing this idea, because it's the obvious thing for society, for life to survive.
Yeah, well, it isn't obvious to me that I'm in any position to evaluate Elon Musk. Like, I would like to talk to him and find out what he's up to and why. But, I mean, he's an impossible person. What he's done is impossible. All of it. It's like he built an electric car that works. Now, does it work completely, and will it replace gas cars, or should it? I don't know. But if we're going to build electric cars, he seems to be the best at that by a lot. And he more or less did that. People carp about him, but he more or less did that by himself. I know he's very good at distributing responsibility and all of that, but he's the spearhead. And then that was pretty hard. And then he built a rocket at like 1/10 the price of NASA rockets. And then he shot his car out into space. That's pretty hard. And then he's building this boring company, more or less as a, what would you call it? It's this whimsical joke in some sense, but it's not a joke. He's amazing.
And Neuralink, delving into the depths of the mind.
And Starlink, it's like, go Elon, as far as I'm concerned. And then, he puts his finger on things so oddly. The problem is underpopulation. It's like, I think so too. I think it's a terrible problem that the West, for example, is no longer at replacement with regard to birth rate. It means we've abandoned the virgin and the child in a most fundamental sense. It's a bloody catastrophe. And Musk, he sees it clear as can be. It's like, well, and where everyone else is running around going, oh, there's too many people. It's like, nope. Got that. Not only, see, I've learned that there are falsehoods and lies, and there are anti-truths. And an anti-truth is something that's so preposterous that you couldn't make a claim that's more opposite to the truth. And the claim that there are too many people on the planet is an anti-truth. So, people say, well, you have to accept limits to growth and et cetera. It's like, I have to accept the limits that you're going to impose on me because you're frightened of the future. That's your theory, is it? Okay.
Well, it's an idea. It could be a right idea. It could be a wrong idea. I think anti-truth.
Here, I'll tell you why it's the wrong idea, I think. So imagine that there's an emergency. Dragon. There's a dragon. Someone comes and says, there's a dragon. I'm the guy to deal with it. That's what the environmentalists say, the radical types who push limits to growth. Then I look at them and I think, okay, is that dragon real or not? That's one question. Well,
I ask that question of myself every time when I spend time alone.
Is the apocalypse looming on the environmental front? Yes or no? I'll just leave that aside for the time being. I think you can make